So after talking about transportation rates in part one, we're now going to talk about some other important topics. And the first one we're going to talk about is domestic US shipping terms. In domestic terms of trade, the term FOB is used a lot, which stands for free on board. Its historical origin comes from it being historically the seller's or the supplier's duty to place goods on a shipping vessel without charge to the buyer. So the buyer may pay for the shipping, but the seller would take goods and load up the ship, and that would be included in the price of the item. So that was called, like, this is the price from the seller, FOB price, free on board, because this price includes the seller's responsibility to go and load up the ship. The Uniform Commercial Code was established in the United States in 1952 to simplify trade across the United States, and it's been adopted by all 50 states. And part of the Uniform Commercial Code, UCC, are the FOB terms used in US domestic shipments. Now, the confusing thing, or that can be confusing, is that there's an International Chamber of Commerce, ICC. I guess the UCC is the domestic US commercial code. Then there's ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, which established Incoterms, which are for international trade. And Incoterms have various versions. Before 2020, there was Incoterms 2010. They were updated, and I'm going to present the latest Incoterms 2020 to you in this lecture. And so you have to keep these two things separate because there's an FOB term in Incoterms as well, which works slightly differently. So you're going to see how all of this works, but please keep in mind that the domestic terms of trade are governed by UCC, Uniform Commercial Code, and then the international terms of trade, Incoterms, are governed by the International Chamber of Commerce, and they're two different things. And even though one term is common between them, FOB, it's used differently, and we'll see in detail how it's used differently. So in domestic shipping, the term FOB has two things that come after it. The first term that comes after FOB specifies who owns the goods in transit. So if the supplier ships goods via rail or truck or a local or a waterway, like along a river on a barge, and natural disaster strikes and your goods get destroyed. So who owned the goods in transit? Who is going to be at loss? Who's going to go file an insurance claim? Is it the buyer of goods or the supplier of goods? So that has to be specified, and that's specified by a term which is either origin or destination in the FOB. So let's say FOB origin or FOB destination. FOB origin means that at the shipping point, the goods become the buyer's goods. So during the shipping or the transit, the transportation, if goods get damaged, the loss is borne by the buyer. The supplier is kind of like, I've done my part. I didn't own the goods in transit because it was FOB origin. Okay. Origin means origin of the shipment. FOB destination means that the title of the goods passes to the buyer when the goods reach their destination. So along the journey, if the goods get destroyed, it is the seller who had a loss. The seller had the loss of their goods. They were not passed on to the buyer yet. So the buyer may not even have to pay the supplier because they didn't get the title to the goods. Now remember that if we do use FOB destination, where the buyer will own the goods at the destination, then from the buyer's company, there will be no pipeline inventory cost, because pipeline inventory cost is the cost of having inventory, owning inventory that's in transit. But the buyer doesn't own this inventory in transit. So the buyer has zero pipeline cost. And instead, the supplier will have outbound pipeline cost, because any goods the supplier ships in FOB destination, they're on the supplier's financial books as an asset of the supplier until their title passes on to the buyer at the destination. The second term that gets added to FOB indicates who pays for the transportation. So you have FOB origin or FOB destination, and then there's another term added, which can be one of four options. It can either be FOB origin or destination, and you add the second term, which will be prepaid or collect, or prepaid and charged back, or collect and allowed. First, try to understand prepaid and collect, and then the other two will make sense. Prepaid means that the transportation company is going to be paid by the one who initiated the transportation, which is the supplier. So the supplier pays for the transportation. Okay, that's what prepaid means, because to the buyer it appears prepaid. When the buyer receives the goods, they don't have to pay the trucking company. The trucking company says, oh, we're already paid. Right? Imagine a truck shows up to your warehouse, they offload the goods, and you want to pay the truck driver, hey, here's the payment for the transportation. The truck driver says, no, I'm prepaid. I was paid by the supplier. Right? That's prepaid. Collect is the opposite, where the transportation company is going to collect the payment for the transportation when they deliver the goods. So collect means the receiver or the buyer pays the freight when the goods are delivered. Now, in both of prepaid and collect, you can have the original payment made by the respective party. So prepaid, the original payment could be made by the shipper, but then the shipper could get reimbursed by the buyer. And the buyer could say, hey, shipper, you were nice, you paid the transportation cost, but according to our contract, I'm supposed to pay it. So here's a refund. I'm going to refund you the transportation costs you paid. That's prepaid and charged back. The shipper pays the freight, but the cost is charged to the buyer in the invoice. So the invoice the buyer gets is the amount you pay for the goods, and then, the chargeback amount for the transportation. Collect is the opposite, where the buyer or the receiver is going to pay the transportation cost to begin with. So the transportation company can collect the cost from the receiver, but now the receiver, the buyer, is allowed to deduct this amount when they pay the invoice to the supplier. So the invoice will have, this is the amount, this is the dollar value of the goods you have to pay the supplier. Then the receiver will say, okay, since I paid the transportation company and I was not supposed to pay, like the cost is supposed to be part of the product or the supplier was supposed to pay, but I paid them, I'm going to subtract this amount from what I paid to the supplier. So it's allowed to deduct from the invoice. So receiver pays the freight, but the cost is borne by the shipper, the supplier company, because the receiver adjusted in the payment to the shipper. Okay. So that gives you these 6 different possibilities. You have FOB origin collect. You can ignore the term freight here. Some people just call it FOB origin collect. Some people call it FOB origin freight collect. Okay, so just to keep things short, I'm going to remove the word freight when I say it. I'm just going to say FOB origin collect, FOB origin prepaid, FOB origin freight prepaid and charged back. Okay, and then you have FOB destination prepaid, FOB destination collect, FOB destination collect and allowed. Okay. So these are the 6 FOB terms used in domestic trade. Now, who owns the goods in transit? Whenever it says origin, the buyer will own the goods in transit. So the first column is just converting origin to buyer, destination to seller. Because whenever it's origin, the title of the goods passed on to the buyer at the start, at the origin of the shipment or transportation, whereas FOB destination, the title passes to the buyer at the end of the shipment, the transportation, and that is why the seller owns the good in transit for FOB destination. So the first column is simple. Who handles freight claims? Like if there's a loss or damage and you have to charge the insurance company and so forth. Well, whoever owns the goods. The owner is the one who had a loss, so the owner must go deal with the insurance. So origin will go to owner is buyer, buyer handles freight claims. Destination will go to seller is the owner of the goods in transit, seller will handle the freight claims. So column 2 is just like column 1, and column 1 is just origin goes to buyer, destination goes to seller. Okay. Let's look at the third column. Who selects and pays the carrier? Okay. So here, prepaid is going to always go to be a seller, and collect is always going to be a buyer. Collect means the buyer will pay the transportation company, and whoever's going to pay is also going to the one who's going to say, okay, this company is going to move the goods, because you hire the company. If you are going to pay them, you hire them. So whenever it says collect, that means buyer is going to pay for transportation and buyer is going to hire the transportation company. Whenever it says prepaid, whether it's simple prepaid or prepaid and charged back, either way, the seller will pay and select the transportation company. Same thing for the bottom three, where it says prepaid, it's going to be seller. Where it says collect or collect and allowed, it's going to be the buyer who selects and pays the carrier. Now, who bears the ultimate cost of transportation? Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, but it's really straightforward if you got to column 3. If you understood column 3, all you're going to do is, wherever it says something after prepaid or collect, like and chargeback or and allowed, that's where you're going to flip it. So if it's seller and it says and chargeback, you flip the seller to buyer. Otherwise, there's no and chargeback or no and allowed at the end of prepaid or collect, then simply the second last column, the third column, becomes the fourth column. But whenever there's an and, that means you're going to flip the responsibility because you're going to charge it back to the other party. And so the seller here in the third row will become buyer in the last column, because the seller adds the freight cost to the goods invoice and the buyer will have to pay the cost of the freight. In the last row, the same thing happens. Collect means buyer will pay, but because the buyer is allowed to deduct that payment, the seller is ultimately going to be responsible because the buyer will deduct the freight cost from the goods payment. Okay. And so, this is the cheat sheet to understand this table. Okay, a lot of books will give you this table, but nobody gives you this cheat sheet. And so once you understand this cheat sheet, you can just create this table from memory. All you have to remember is origin means the title of the goods passes to the buyer at the shipping point. So buyer owns goods in transit. Destination means seller will own the goods in transit. Prepaid means the shipper pays. Collect means the receiver pays. If prepaid and charged back, then the shipper will pay initially, but it will be charged back and the buyer will bear the responsibility. Same thing with collect and allowed. Collect means the receiver will pay initially, but then charge it back to the supplier. Okay. So with that, if you understand those definitions, you can create this table, easily understand all of these terms. Let's do some self-testing. Okay. The picture represents what's happening. So we have a seller in New York, buyer in Los Angeles. The tick indicates that the seller owns the good in transit, which means it cannot be FOB origin, because in FOB origin, the buyer owns the goods in transit. So immediately I know the right answer has to be D, or E has to be FOB destination, because only in FOB destination does the seller own the goods in transit. And in this picture, the tick indicates the seller owns the good in transit. And then the seller is paying the company and there's nothing coming from the buyer to the seller. So it's going to be freight prepaid, or option D. Okay, because in prepaid means the seller pays for the transportation. Let's look at this picture. Here the tick mark has moved to the buyer. So the buyer owns the good in transit. So it has to be in one of the origins. FOB origin options A, B, or C cannot be FOB destination, because in FOB destination, the seller owns the good in transit. So I've narrowed it down to A, B, and C. And the buyer is paying the transportation company. There's no chargeback or there's no, deduction of that payment from the invoice. And so it's going to be collect, because in collect, the buyer pays for the transportation. So it's going to be option A, FOB origin, freight, collect. Okay, let's do one more. Now this is interesting. So the buyer owns the goods in transit. Look at the tick mark, which means it's going to be in FOB origin, not FOB destination. So I can eliminate choices D and E immediately. So it's one of A, B, and C. But in this case, the supplier is paying the transportation company and then the buyer is refunding the seller. So if the seller pays, it's going to be a prepaid option, and then you're going to do and after prepaid and charged back, because the buyer is going to refund the supplier. So it's going to be option C, freight prepaid and charged back. So that was it, short and sweet for the domestic terms of trade. Now we're going to look at international terms of sale, also called terms of trade, which are set by the ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, whereas the domestic terms were established by UCC, Uniform, Code of Commerce or something like that. And so now we look at the Incoterms, which are used in international shipping. And there are multiple terms. One of them is FOB, but used differently than a domestic one. It's not FOB origin or FOB prepaid and things like that. It's going to be different FOB. So the goal of Incoterms is to describe the responsibilities of exporter, seller, and importer, buyer in international trade. And it's important that these responsibilities be defined so that any conflicts can be resolved, and it's clear who's going to bear what cost. And it's clear who bears the risk. If the shipment gets damaged at a certain point, who's the owner of that? So the latest version is Incoterms 2020, which we're going to see here. This is a very nice summary of the Incoterms. So on the left, you have in black this icon for a factory. It says factory on the top. Okay. Then you may use some mode of transportation to move goods from a factory to the port. Then from the port, and the term alongside ship refers to goods being placed in a terminal on the port to be loaded on the ship. That's alongside ship. And then on board is when you put the goods onto the ship. Then the ship travels in the seas and oceans. Then it reaches a destination. Then you have alongside ship again, which is offloaded from the ship onto the port. And then they are moved with other modes of transportation to the destination place, which could be a terminal, a port terminal, or they could be moved all the way to the buyer's location. I mean, they'll eventually have to go to the buyer's location, and between the destination place and the buyer's location, you may have the buyer providing truck service or transportation, paying for transportation. Okay. So those are the different stages. Now, in this diagram here on the left, in these bubbles, you have the three letter acronyms for the Incoterms. So EXW stands for Ex-Works. We'll see their details shortly. Okay. And for each Incoterm, you have this horizontal bar. Some of it is yellow, some of it is blue. Yellow means that the supplier is at that stage paying for the transportation costs. And blue means that the buyer is paying for the transportation costs. Okay. Then the triangle with the exclamation mark is the point at which the risk transfers. The risk transfer means that now if something happens to the good, the other party is responsible and they have to deal with insurance or do whatever else they want. Okay. You'll notice that usually the triangle with the exclamation mark is at a point where the yellow changes to the blue. And so where the risk passes on, usually the other party, the buyer, also starts to pay for transportation. But in some cases, the triangle with the exclamation mark is earlier, and the yellow changes to blue later on. Okay, so it is possible that the risk passes on, but the seller or the supplier has paid for the journey to a later point. Now, it's very important to understand these terms because look at the first term, Ex-Works. In Ex-Works, the supplier is responsible to make the goods available for loading at their dock or at their facility, and that is where the responsibility ends. So this has the least responsibility for the seller. So the seller says, here are the goods ready at my factory. Everything else is now on you. You know, when your truck arrives, I load it onto the truck. And then you take it to a rail car terminal, you take it to a port, you do whatever you want with that. And what can actually happen is when you are trying to find a supplier and different suppliers give you the price they're going to charge for the goods, you can't select a supplier on that price if the price is Ex-Works price, because different suppliers have different locations and it's going to cost you different amounts to move the goods from the supplier to your facility or to a port in their country where it can be shipped, and then the rest of the way for whichever supplier you pick, the journey is the same, so it's going to cost the same. This actually happened with a real company I was visiting for research purposes, and they said that their purchasing team switched a supplier to go for a cheaper supplier, but they didn't understand logistics. So they picked an inland supplier that was far from the port because that supplier was cheaper. But when you added the transportation cost of going, and it was an X works price. So when you added the transportation cost of going from this new inland supplier all the way to the shore to the port, and the old supplier was very near the port. So when you got to the port, this new supplier was costing more than the old supplier because of that increased transportation expense. But the purchasing team just compared the price, which was the X works price, because when usually suppliers give you a price for the goods, they're not adding in transportation costs, just giving an X works price. And they said, oh, we can save, this many dollars, but they're actually going to end up spending more on transportation now. So it's very important to, when you are going out and selecting a supplier, to convert the price, add on the transportation expense to a point that will be shared no matter which supplier you pick. So let's say you are in the United States and you're picking a supplier in Asia. You might pick that point to be a port in the US, like Savannah, Georgia port, and you might add the transportation expense to every supplier you evaluate to bring their goods to Savannah, Georgia, and then you compare their price at that point. But again, this may not work very well because some sellers might have a shorter journey to the East Coast, Savannah, Georgia. Other sellers or suppliers may have a shorter journey or a cheaper journey to the Los Angeles port on the West Coast. And you may have to go further. You may have to go inland and say, okay, I'm going to add up all the transportation expense to supplier price till the goods arrived at my warehouse or my distribution center or my factory in the US. And now I can compare apples to apples on what it'll cost me to use any supplier. And some of the suppliers who are really cheap on the unit cost may drop out or may end up becoming more expensive because they're in such a location from which the transportation is very expensive to get it to your factory. So really, also some suppliers may be in countries with higher tariffs, other suppliers may be in countries with lower tariffs. So DDP, the last row of this picture, is everything included in the is being covered by the supplier or is included in the price. So the duties, the tariffs, all the cost to take the goods up to the buyer's facility, like their factory or warehouse, is going to be included DDP. So you kind of want to convert all the X works type of prices suppliers give you to what the price would be if you did like DDP, if you added in all the cost and the tariffs to get it to your facility, and then you compare and select suppliers. So this is extremely important in international or global procurement. And we don't study procurement in this course. We're focusing on logistics. Other courses you may look at procurement and they may not cover that there. So you have to connect the things and make sure you compare apples to apples when you compare supplier prices. You add in the duties and the tariffs, you add in the transportation expense and see what is the landed cost for using that supplier. What is the cost of the item when it lands at your facility, having gone through ports, having gone through customs, having gone through all of those expenses. Okay, now some other important things to understand. 4 of these options: FAS, free alongside ship; FOB, free on board; CFR, CIF. CFR means cost and freight paid. CIF means cost, insurance, and freight paid. These 4 terms, there's an icon of a ship or a boat. You can see the blue ship or boat in the beginning of the yellow bar. These 4 terms only apply when you're shipping something on sea or water. Whereas the other terms apply to all carriers. Okay, you could be shipping them by rail or truck or air or boat. Okay, and you have to remember that there are many countries that share a border, so you could go do international trade using trucks. You could do international trade using rail. Like think about Mexico and Canada and the US. You could do international trade over air. And so for all of rail, truck, air, all of these terms apply except the 4 where there's a boat icon next to the term in the yellow row. Those 4 only apply over water. Okay. The exact terminology is listed in the yellow bar. So EXW is listed X works, FCA is free carrier, FAS free alongside ship, FOB is free on board. See, this FOB also came in domestic shipments, but in domestic, you would say FOB origin, FOB destination. Here you don't say that. You say FOB and then you specify the port of shipment. So in a lot of these terms, you have to specify the place or port. So see, X works, the agreed place is a supplier's facility, but FCA, you specify which carrier's facility is the buyer going to take up from. So maybe the supplier delivers the goods to a rail terminal, and then from then on, it's the buyer's has to pay and the buyer's responsibility. Or maybe the supplier delivers the goods to an LTL shipping terminal with LTL truck shipments, or maybe delivers to an airport terminal, right? And so there's an agreed upon place you have to define in FCA. X work, the agreed upon place is always a supplier's facility. Okay? And then a lot of these terms, you have to supply a port. They have to be delivered to a certain port. Okay? And then in some of them, you have to define a place which comes after the port. It could be a terminal after the port. It could be a cross dock. It could be the terminal of a local transportation company that's going to then truck or rail the stuff over to you. Okay. And in the last two, you specify the destination, the address of your warehouse or facility to which the goods will be delivered. So everything that you need to know is basically in this one picture. And so I want you to take time to really understand this picture. So let's go over some of these commonly used terms. I'm not going to go over all of them, but some of the ones which you should really know. X works. The seller simply makes the goods available at their business premises or factory. Buyer is responsible for all transportation, export and import, bearing all risks and costs. Sellers love this when especially smaller sellers, smaller suppliers that don't have international logistics experience, that don't have the bandwidth or the volumes to get good rates from a lot of the transportation companies, and they say, okay, we are not good at transportation. We don't have the volumes to negotiate good deals. You guys take care of transportation from our facility. We just, send us a truck or container or whatever. We'll load it up and you take it and do what you want. FCA is a little bit more than that. The seller delivers goods to the carrier selected by the buyer at a terminal. So it could be a rail terminal, could be a trucking terminal, could be a port. But usually if it's a port, you call it FAS, like an international shipping port. So it's going to be like a terminal of a carrier company that's inland, usually with FCA. Once the seller delivers goods to that terminal, it's buyer's responsibility then for. Very popular for international containerized shipments. Why? Because a lot of terminals at the ports where you're going to ship containers, the terminal is a little bit away from the port where the containers arrive, and then the port will handle that and move them to the ship or alongside the ship and then on the ship. Okay. So FCA is very, very commonly used for international containerized shipments because it makes sense, right? Let's say you're buying something from Vietnam. You don't know which trucking companies are good in Vietnam. You may not have the expertise to deal with them. So you tell the supplier, you deal with the inland transportation in your country in Vietnam. Once the goods get to the port terminal, then I will pay an international shipping carrier to take the goods from the terminal, bring them to me. I'll handle all the rest. I'll handle the duties and customs in my country. You just take them to the port terminal in your country because I don't know how to handle trucking inside Vietnam. So the seller will produce the goods, put them in carton boxes, load up a container or containers, and then have the containers moved to the terminal at the port, and then that's where the ownership, the risk, and the payment for the transportation services transfers to the buyer. FAS, the seller is responsible for getting the goods all the way to the specific port and placing them beside the ship. Beside the ship means the loading area where the big cranes are operating. They're picking up the containers and putting them on the ship. This is not used with containers, FAS, because container handling in most international ports, they have a terminal where they want to receive the containers, do the paperwork, and then move the containers on their own schedule to alongside the ship. Okay. So if you are using containerized transportation, you'll usually be using FCA, not FAS. FAS is used when the goods are kind of loaded into the ship in like a cargo hold, not on a container. So sometimes you're transporting things like coal or LNG, liquid natural gas, or oil and gas, things like that. There, you may have to transport the things right all the way till it's alongside the ship at the loading type of area. Or agriculture products, because sometimes they're loaded not in those standard containers, but in a big cargo hold of the ship. Yeah. So buyer will pay for the goods to be loaded on the ship. So it's not free on board. You're not onboarding the goods on the ship. Just pay them next to the ship where the loading area of the port is. And oftentimes for agriculture produce or a bigger cargo like coal, they'll have a special loading area, not the one where containers are. And so you'll take the good, the supplier will take the goods all the way to that loading area, and then the buyer will pay for the goods being loaded onto the ship and henceforth. Okay. With containers is FCA. So remember, that's very important. Containers is mostly FCA. And if it's non-container, you're going to be FAS. Okay. Then free on board is the seller is responsible for all expenses and the goods till the cargo is loaded onto the ship at the named port. So in international shipping in FOB, you have to specify the name of the port. Okay. This is used for non-containerized freight, where extra coordination and work is required for loading such goods on the ship, such as iron ore, sugar, oil, chemicals, LNG, massive items like turbine blades that do not fit containers. Okay. So containers, as I mentioned, you are mostly going to go with FCA. FAS and FOB are not as common with containers. They're mostly used with non-containerized freight, where you have special loading stuff happening to load them on ships, sometimes on special ships. Cost and freight, CFR. Okay, if you go back to this picture, look at this CFR. Okay, here the seller is going to pay for all the way to the destination port. Okay, but the risk will transfer over once the seller loads once the boat or the ship is loaded in the seller's country. Okay, so CFR seller is responsible for all costs and freight expenses to bring the cargo to the agreed upon destination port in the destination country, and buyer is responsible for unloading charges, custom clearance fees, and transportation from the port onto the facility. Risk transfers to buyer once the goods are on the ship. So while they're going through the oceans and seas, the risk is with the buyer. CIF is very similar to CFR, where the insurance is also paid by the seller, but a lot of people don't like to use CIF, because if the supplier is going to pay for the insurance along the way on the sea, the supplier is going to buy the cheapest insurance there is, just to tick the box, okay, I paid for insurance. That insurance may be pretty worthless. So as a buyer, because the goods are your responsibility, if they get hijacked on the sea or something happens, you have to deal with the insurance company. When you have to deal with the insurance company, you want to buy the insurance yourself. So you would do CFR and buy and pick the insurance company yourself, rather than do CIF. So CIF is not that commonly used. And then DAP is this one where you deliver that place, but the duty is paid by the buyer, or the tariffs are paid by the buyer. And DDP is where the seller will pay the tariffs. And obviously they built that into the price. If they're paying the tariffs, the price is going to go higher. Okay. Now, one thing you want to understand about international shipments is, remember we talked about in LTL shipments and even truckload shipments, how the from and to matter. So going from Chicago to Florida is probably gonna be more expensive than going from Florida to Chicago, just because of the demand supply. Lots of demand for cargo to move to Florida. It's a consumption state. A lot less demand for stuff to move out of Florida. So when demand is low, the suppliers have to give you discounts to attract your business. Same thing in international trade. Okay, so this data is a little bit old. I couldn't find the latest data, but the principle holds, and the principle is what matters. So the yellow boxes tell you, these boxes are laid along lines which indicate shipping routes, international shipping routes. The top yellow box applies when you're moving east or north along that route. For vertical routes, it's north. For horizontal routes, it's east. And the grayish box tells you the price to move west or south. So let's look at this route between New York to Rotterdam, okay, in Europe. The yellow part tells you that one 40-foot container is going to cost you $1,810. Okay. So that is not going from Rotterdam to New York. That's going the other way. It's going east. So if you go from New York to Rotterdam, it costs you $1,810. But if you go the same distance, but from Rotterdam to New York, it's going to cost you $2,500 and $2,520. Cost you a lot more. Why? Because there's a lot of containers being imported by the New York port. So ships going to the New York port are full. They don't need to give you a discount. They're already getting a lot of business. But ships going back to Europe are not full. There's not a lot of stuff flowing from US to Europe, and so they're willing to give you a discount to attract your business. Look at New York to Santos. Okay. Equal. So that shows you between like South America and New York, the demand is about equal both sides, 3,060. Okay, and pretty expensive too. So there's a lot of stuff flowing on that route. Rotterdam to South America also 2750, 2550, very close or very similar demand on both sides. Let's look at Shanghai to Melbourne, Australia. So going south is expensive, $3,690. So China to Australia. Going Australia to China is cheap, $1,570. And again, that's expected. Australia imports a lot of stuff from China. Australia does not export a lot of stuff to China. So on the way back, the ships are kind of empty, shipping a lot of empty containers, bringing empty containers back to China for reuse. And so, they may not look empty because you'll see the containers stacked up, but the containers are empty because they don't have enough demand to fill all the containers. So they're shipping empty containers back. So they're willing to give you a deep discount if you can ship something because they have to ship the empty container back anyway. But going to Australia, there's a lot of demand that way, and so it's very expensive. So remember, you cannot just flip things. If it costs you X amount of dollars to go from A to B, you cannot assume B to A will be the same amount. It could be less, it could be more. And this shows you that you have to look at the volumes, the demand on that in that direction. And obviously, the higher the demand, usually the price will go up. But if the demand is low, then you'll start to get discounts and the price will go down. Okay, so I made this slide just so people don't get confused by FOB domestic versus FOB international. Okay. So FOB domestic is used in USA, maybe a few other parts of North America, mostly USA. FOB domestic, which is FOB origin, FOB destination, FOB origin prepaid, those sorts of terms, they apply to any mode, truck, rail, or air. But in the Incoterms, they apply globally all over the world for international shipments. And some Incoterms, including the FOB, the ICC version, the global version, only applies to sea waterways. So remember, there were 4 terms. If you go back to this picture, these 4, where there's a boat icon, including FOB, the second one of these 4, these 4 only apply to sea/waterways. They don't apply to rail or truck or air. Okay. But the FOB domestic applies to all of them. FOB does define legal title ownership, so prepaid versus destination does specify when the title changes. The international shipping terms are not associated with the title, but associated with risk and cost. Who bears the risk? And bears the risk is kind of like ownership, because if something goes bad, it's your responsibility. And who bears the cost? But they don't define the title because that could depend on other international laws and regulations. Maybe there could be issues to do with customs when the title actually changes hands. And so the international Incoterms do not say, okay, the title is going to change hand at this point, but they do specify risk and cost. And usually when you have the risk, it's kind of like you are responsible whether the title belongs to you or not. So it's kind of like you can think of the risk part as being similar to ownership. Okay, so the FOB version in the US domestic will specify FOB origin or FOB destination, and then also specify prepaid or collect at the end. But in the international version, there's just one word, which is the name of a port after that. So FOB is going to be FOB and then a name of a port, and usually it's going to be a port in the country of the seller. So, if you are in a country with multiple ports, it'll always specify exactly which port will take the goods to. Then the risk point depends on origin versus destination for FOB domestic. If it's FOB origin, the seller's dock, that's where the risk transfers to the buyer and the title. And for international Incoterms, it depends on the Incoterm used. For the FOB with the port specified, because it's free on board, the risk transfers when the goods are on board the ship. Okay, for the FOB Incoterm. But the other Incoterms, they have their own risk points, and you have that graphic representation right here, where this triangle with exclamation mark tells you the point at which the risk is transferred. Okay, some tips. FCA versus FOB port for international shipments. Under ICC rules, sellers prefer FCA, not FOB, for international containerized shipments. Okay, that's why I said FCA is going to be used a lot more with containerized cargo moving in internationally. Containers are typically handed over to the carrier at the container yard or terminal, at which is just outside the port, and the seller is unable to take them to the ship. If a container is damaged at the terminal before it gets on the ship with FOB port, the seller is still liable even though they no longer have the goods. So sellers will often say, we'll do FCA, we're not going to do FOB, or free alongside ship. FAS, we'll just do FCA, and then because you are hiring the shipping company, and the shipping company is going to pay the port for the port operations. So when you pay for the international transportation, the port operations are part of that shipping transport service that you paid for. And so when we deliver it to the port as a seller, we are done, right? And so that's why they like FCA, and most international containerized transportation trade happens under FCA, not FOB. FOB with a generic location like USA, FOB USA for Michigan is always an error, because in domestic terms, you don't specify a country or a state after FOB, you say FOB origin or FOB destination. And in the international FOB, you specify a port in the seller's country. So USA is not a port, Michigan is not a port. You can't say FOB Michigan, FOB USA. Okay. So if you see something like that in paperwork, that's going to be an error. Okay, we're going to talk briefly about documentation. There's a saying amongst transportation managers that freight moves on a sea of papers. So there's a lot of documentation involved. And we're just going to look at some of the common ones just so you understand what are some of the documents involved. We're not going to be comprehensive at all. There's lots of other documents involved, but you need to have an idea of some of the major documents that you'll be dealing with. So bill of lading, notice it's not loading, it's not landing, it's lading. Okay, you'll often see it shortened as B/L or BOL. So you will hear this term thrown about a lot if you're working in logistics or transportation. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what is this bill of lading thing. Lading means loading. Both words are derived from the Old English word laden. Okay. Carriers using all modes of transportation issue bills of lading when they undertake the transportation of cargo. So BL, the short form, is a document receipt that is signed by the carrier and the original given to the shipper once the goods are loaded onto the vessel. It's often generated by the shipper. So it's a document that the shipper can show anybody else because it has a signature of the carrier company that proves that the goods were handed over to the carrier. Now you'll realize its importance when we talk about letter of credit, because the seller, to get paid, has to show evidence that they actually delivered the goods, right? And once the seller hands over the goods to the carrier, it's not depending on the Incoterm, it may not be the seller's responsibility beyond that point. At least the seller cannot see what happens to them. The carrier takes care of the rest of the part, right? So the seller needs a signature as proof that, hey, we have done our part. We created the goods or bought the goods or made the goods. We packaged them. We gave them to this carrier. This is the name of the carrier. And here is a signature confirming that we have given the goods to the carrier and we have done our part of the job. Okay. So bill of lading, one thing it really does is show that the shipper or the seller has done their job. And now it's with the carrier company. If you have regularly shipped goods, so you don't want to be filling out or writing by hand the bill of ladings every day, every week. You may be shipping out on a daily, weekly schedule from the supplier, and then they'll pre-print the bill of lading, and whenever they give the goods over to the carrier will just sign that to save time instead of having to hand fill everything out. Obviously, these computers generate these documents for the most part, right? But even for a computer pod, you don't have to type in all the details every single day. You can automate that, and if something is shipped very frequently, you can create those BLs, bill of ladings, and then the carrier will just sign on them when they get goods from the seller. So what is the function of the bill of lading? So the first part I already mentioned is the evidence of contract between the shipper and the carrier, legal proof that carrier has received freight. Once the shipper, the seller gets that signature, they can use that in a court of claims with an insurance company, things like that, to show, hey, we did our part, we gave the goods to the carrier. This is really important for the supplier to get paid, especially under CFR and FOB, because the supplier, if you look at FOB, the supplier's job is done, and they can say, okay, we don't have to pay for the remaining transportation, and we are not responsible, and now we need to get paid because we've done our work. Now, this bill of lading is also used on the receiving end to show that the person receiving the goods is the person the goods should go to. So if you are on the receiving side and you get sent the bill of lading, the document by FedEx or something, and you have the original bill of lading with the shipper's signature, then you have the right to collect those goods from customs and from the port. Okay. And then it's also receipt of cargo, that the cargo has been transferred to the carrier in apparent good order and conditions. Then it also has information that the carrier needs on the destination of the goods and so forth, and what type of goods there are. It also stipulates contract terms, including carrier's liability for loss and damage, if the carrier is liable for loss and damage, and things like that. The straight BL, which is very common these days, has the name and address of the receiver listed on the BL. So the carrier is under legal obligation to only deliver goods to a specified consignee at the receiver. So if you are importing something and you go to collect your goods at the port to clear customs, and they say, oh, somebody else just took your goods, you don't want that to happen, which is why they will verify that you are the company, you represent the company that's listed on the bill of lading. So I remember when I worked, our company, the goods that will be shipped to our company, we had these people that were authorized to receive goods on behalf of the company. They would go to the port, and they would have documentation showing they can receive on behalf of this company, and then they would clear all the goods that were coming for our company from the customs, and then have them passed on to the local carrier to be trucked to our warehouse. Order BL is more of a order bill allows the delivery to be made to whoever possesses the endorsed signed original BL. Okay, this is used when this is also used where you want to have, let's say, a third party receive the goods. So let's say you're far from the port, and you can send your company representative to the port and clear the goods through customs and then have them loaded onto a local domestic carrier. So then you could have an order BL where the original signed bill of lading that comes to you via FedEx or something, you give it to the carrier company and say, hey, take this, go to the port, get my goods cleared and put on trucks and brought to my warehouse. To order blank or to order of bearer bill of lading. Okay, this is more of a historical thing where you would have these coal mines load coal onto the rail. They wouldn't have a seller yet. They don't know who's going to buy this coal. And they would ship it on the rail with to order of bearer bill of lading, which they would have, the original. And then the person from a coal mine, like a salesman, would go to the city and say, okay, I have this much coal coming to the city on rail, or it's already arrived. Who wants to buy it? And if somebody wants to buy the coal, he would give them the bill of lading and sign it, and then they could put their name in the blank or just his order of bearer. They would take that bill of lading to the railway station and get their coal. Okay, so used with coal, with iron ore, things like that, where the mine that's producing the coal or iron ore doesn't have a cellar when it's loaded onto the train. But when the train goes to a major city, they send their salesman there with to the order of bearer bill of ladings, and he sells them and gives the customers the order of bearer bill of lading, and then they go and release the goods from the railway station. To order of XYZ bank, this is used when banks are involved. Because the bank endorses the bill of lading, gives it to the intended consignee upon receipt of payment, because here the bank is ensuring that the shipper or the seller gets paid. So the bank will give the bill of lading to the importer, the customer, once they have made sure that the importer is giving money to the bank to send it to the supplier. And this is kind of used with letter of credit to ensure that the bank is ensuring that the supplier will get paid. And getting money from the consignee, the receiver, before giving them the bill of lading. Okay, so then we have the C-way bill of lading or C-way bill. Okay. C-way bill cannot be used to confer title of goods. Shipment automatically released to consignee after import formalities are complete. It's like a bill of lading, but it's not a document of title. Originally, it's not required by consignee to receive the goods. Okay. Instead, because the C-way bill has the consignee listed, okay, the name of the company or the address or name of a person, goods are released to that consignee automatically once the import formalities are complete. Okay. It's often used for shipments between a company and a subsidiary in a different country, or when two companies trade without using letter of credit. And this will make more sense when we talk about letter of credit. Okay. So basically what it means is letter of credit is used when the buyer and the seller don't trust each other, and the letter of credit ensures that the supplier will get paid if the goods are delivered. But when you don't have the trust problem, you're just shipping goods within the same company to a subsidiary, then you can avoid a lot of transaction costs by not having letter of credit and using a C-way bill to send goods over, and they're automatically released to your subsidiary. Okay, so let's talk about letter of credit. This is a really important document in import, export, and international trade. So you should have a basic understanding of what a letter of credit is. You'll hear BL, bill of lading, and letter of credit a lot if you work in transportation and international logistics. Okay, so here's the problem that the letter of credit solves. In international trade, there can be an issue of trust. The buyer might place an order with the supplier. Supplier spends 2 months creating those products and then puts them on a ship, and the buyer says, I never got them. Even if the buyer got them, they say, oh, I don't know what happened to that shipment. I don't know where it went. I'm not going to pay you. Or vice versa, the supplier could not ship the goods and claim that they shipped them, or have the buyer pay in advance and then kind of not ship the goods or ship a lower quantity or a lower, not the agreed upon shipment, and just keep the payment. So there needs to be a third party that can bridge this trust gap and make sure that the buyer does pay and that the supplier does get paid if the supplier ships the goods. And that's where the letter of credit comes in. It protects the supplier and makes sure that they get paid if they do the work. It protects the buyer and it makes sure the supplier is not paid if they don't produce the goods. So let's see how it works. So we need a mediator trusted by both sides. So a letter of credit is a document from a bank guaranteeing that a seller will receive payment in full as long as certain delivery conditions have been met. In the event that the buyer is unable to make the payment on the purchase, the bank will cover the outstanding amount. Obviously, it's a letter of credit. The bank checks the credit history of the buyer before issuing it. And there's a fee associated to cover the bank's risk. So if the bank is issuing lots of letter of credits and some of them the buyer doesn't pay, the bank can recover some of that amount through all the fees it's charging or the interest rate it's charging on these sort of loans. And then it can also stop giving letter of credit to that buyer. Also, it's not in the buyer's interest to default on a letter of credit, because then they'll not be able to get another one from the bank. Often, payment terms stipulate payment to the supplier post-delivery, e.g. after 90 days. So, in letter of credit, suppliers don't have to worry about non-payment, because there's a bank in each country that's involved. There's a bank on the supplier side, there's a bank on the buyer side in the buyer's country, and then if the buyer refuses to pay, the bank in the buyer's country will pay the bank in the supplier's country, and the supplier will still get paid, and then the bank would have borne the risk, and then they would deal with their customer, the buyer. Okay, so this is the best graphical representation I could find of all the steps. So if you go by the numbers, step 1 to 9, you understand what happens. So notice that there are 4 parties involved. The applicant for the letter of credit is the purchaser, the buyer, and they need the letter of credit so that the supplier will trust them and deliver the goods. So they deal with the bank, the issuing bank in their own country. So think of this is like Chase Bank or Citibank or some bank in their country. The beneficiary of the letter of credit is the supplier who's going to supply the goods, and they deal with an advising bank in their country, which they know. Each bank has a relationship with their client. So the issuing bank has a relationship with the applicant, the buyer. The advising bank has a relationship with the beneficiary, which is the supplier. And so the supplier trusts their bank trusts the supplier, the buyer trusts their own bank, issuing bank, and the issuing bank trusts the buyer. Okay. So step 1, both the seller and the buyer, the applicant and the beneficiary, agree on a sales contract. Now some suppliers will say, we're not going to start production until you issue letter of credit. And some suppliers will start production if they trust you, but they'll not ship the goods until they get the letter of credit. So step 2, the buyer has to apply for letter of credit. It applies to the bank. Step 3, the issuing bank tells the bank in the supplier's country that, hey, here's the letter of credit. So we confirm we'll make the payment if conditions are met. Step 4, the advising bank gives the letter of credit to the beneficiary. The supplier says, here's your letter of credit. This guarantees you payment. You can start producing the goods, or if you've already produced them, you start the shipment process. Once the seller gets the letter of credit from their bank, the advising letter of credit, the seller will start production and ship the goods, or if they've already produced them, they'll just ship the goods. Step 5 will happen. Once the shipment starts and the beneficiary or the supplier gets the bill of lading, BL, signed by the carrier that they've delivered the goods, then they'll move on to step 6, which is processing of documents. That includes the waybill signed by the carrier. The advising bank will forward these documents to the issuing bank and say, here are the documents proving that the conditions of the terms of trade have been met. If the condition of the terms of trade say that the supplier will be paid after 30 days of shipping, then the clock starts and they will count for the 30 days, but at least that the seller has done their part. Step 8, based on the shipment terms, either upon receiving the documents in step 7 or upon 30 days happening after the goods were shipped or whatever the terms are, the issuing bank will then release the payment and send the money to the advising bank. And then the advising bank will then send the money to the supplier. The issuing bank, which receives the documents from the advising bank, will then release the documents to the buyer, which may have the signed waybill, which the buyer needs to have their goods clear customs and to receive the goods. So that's how the whole process works. You can see that in each stage, the buyer and seller just work with their respective banks. And then the banks arrange the payments and arrange the documents to go back and forth. There's a fee because the banks have to do some work. There's a fee associated with it. But this is often used in international shipments to make sure that payments happen on time and that suppliers will get the payment if they deliver the goods. Okay, so let's move to the last small portion of this lecture, which is talking about transportation management systems and a few key things that we have to handle in transportation. Transportation management refers to the buying and controlling of transportation services by either a shipper or a consignee. Transportation is often the most costly logistics service. Shipper is the person who's shipping the goods, so the transportation service may be purchased by the seller, or consignee. Consignee is the receiver of the goods, so the buyer firm. And then the buyer firm may hire some of the transportation, depending on the Incoterms, right? You saw that in the Incoterms, supplier pays for transportation up to a certain point, and the buyer pays for the rest of the transportation, and that point is different based on the different Incoterms, okay? So the transportation management refers to the buyer company buying and managing the transportation services, and for the seller company buying and managing the transportation services. Transportation management activities include mode selection. Are you going to ship by ocean freight? Are you going to use rail at each end? Are you going to use truck? And we have done some examples of mode selection where we compared the impact on inventory costs and transportation costs and figured out a total cost, took a total cost perspective to see, different modes, how they affect our total logistics costs. Selecting the carriers to do the actual transportation, which is part of transportation management. Okay, you have to transport something. Which company do you go with, or do you go with the 3PL that's going to select the actual carrier? Negotiating rates and contracts with carriers. It could involve management of a private fleet. So like in Amazon, Walmart, they have their private fleets to deliver, move goods between their warehouses and so forth, and warehouses to regional warehouses or to customers. Maintain in-transit visibility. So in a transportation management system, shipments are created and their status is updated. Sometimes they'll link to the carrier company's IT system to get updates on where their goods are. And then they also provide reports where you can monitor the performance of different carriers that you deal with and kind of then decide whether you want to continue with the carrier or not, whether they're giving you on-time delivery or not, and other things like that. Now, in transportation management, when you do all these activities, there's software that can help you. The software is called Transportation Management Systems, TMS. Okay, some ERP systems have this built in as a module that you can activate and enable. You may have to pay for it. And then there are external transportation management software solutions as well, which interact with the ERP system to do these sorts of tasks that we talked about on the previous slide. A lot of times, transportation management systems will help you with routing and scheduling. They will figure out what's the best route and what is the schedule the shipments based on contracts and different times that you've promised the customers. They'll also do load planning. They'll know that, okay, a truckload can be this much. If it's less than this much, you have to use an LTL shipment. How many trucks do you need? They'll do all that or help you do all that, doing the calculations for you. They also, a lot of them have built-in options where you can create a shipment and it will send that shipment information out to different companies that offer shipment services, different carriers, and then those carriers will submit a bid. Okay, I can deliver that shipment for this much money, and then the TMS can summarize the bids for you, and you can pick a bid to accept, and so on. They can track the status of shipments by linking with the IT systems of different carriers, and they can help with appointment scheduling for pickups and drop-offs, like when the truck is going to come for pickup, has to be loaded, and so on. Imagine a large distribution center with many trucks coming daily to bring inbound shipments and take away outbound shipments. And in that case, scheduling those trucks and scheduling the shipments can be a very involved and complicated task. An important activity that transportation management systems allow you to do, and you have to do it whether you have a TMS system or not, is consolidation, because consolidation is a very important strategy to reduce transportation costs. It improves utilization of transportation resources, avoids shipping, half empty trucks and half empty containers. And there are three common types of consolidation. The first one is called vehicle consolidation. We're going to do an example right after this of consolidation that will make you understand it a lot better. Vehicle consolidation means that if you are sending a truck that's not full, can you consolidate multiple shipments to fill up the whole truck? Or even if you're doing LTL shipments, and if you can combine a couple of shipments on the same truck, it can often be cheaper to do one shipment with a larger amount of weight than two separate shipments, because there's fixed costs of pickup and stuff associated with each shipment that you can save on. Okay? So you'll often get a better rate for one 10,000 pound shipment than two 5,000 pound shipments. In total, you'll save money by the one 10,000 pound shipments. So that could include, the consolidation could include multiple stop-offs on the outbound side to deliver different amounts to different places. If they're close by places, you'll have to pay a fee for each stop-off, but that's going to be cheaper than having multiple shipments, one going to one point and one going to another close by point. And if you're doing inbound shipments, then the consolidation can involve multiple pickups. The second type of consolidation is temporal consolidation, where you advance or delay shipments to allow for consolidation. So you have one shipment going out today to Tampa, Florida, another going out tomorrow. Well, if today's shipment can be delayed to tomorrow, that's acceptable. We can just send one shipment tomorrow, consolidate the two shipments together. And then inbound outbound consolidation is a truck comes with goods for your warehouse and it's offloaded, and instead of sending the truck back empty, you have the truck take an outbound shipment. And carriers love that. They don't like their trucks to move with deadheading, like empty trucks to move around. So if you tell a carrier, hey, when you bring in that shipment, I'm going to give you an outbound shipment, they'll give you a little bit of a discount and you can save some money like that. Especially if you expect this to happen repeatedly. So now I'm going to give you some data, and then together we're going to identify some opportunities for consolidation. So imagine we run a facility in Columbus, Ohio, and we are given some inbound and outbound shipment data for the next few days. So we are maybe sitting on March 25th or 26th, and we are looking at the inbound shipments over the next few days, March 27th, 28th, 29th, and 30th. Okay. So you can see that the first column has the origin where the inbound shipment is coming from. The second, and they're all coming to Columbus, Ohio, to our facility. The weight, second column, gives you the weight of each shipment. So a lot of them are LTL shipments. Above 10,000, we'll often do a TL. So you can see that larger shipments, 16,000, 14,000, even though they don't fill up the whole truck, they are TL shipments because it's going to be cheaper to do a TL, but beyond a certain point, like 10,000 pounds. And then the third column is the delivery date when we expect them to arrive at our facility in Columbus, Ohio. And then the service we have is LTL or TL. Okay. And then from our facility in Ohio, we have some outbound shipments scheduled. Okay. And these are in this table with the destination city. The origin for all of these is going to be Columbus, Ohio. They're going to San Antonio, Texas, Cincinnati, Ohio, and all these other cities. The weight is given, the delivery date where we need to deliver them by, and the service, TL, LTL. 1 day means more expensive service to get a 1 day delivery. And there's a 1 day, 2 day service is often used with smaller shipments, 130 pounds, 100 pounds, 150 pounds. Okay. And it's like an LTL shipment, but costs a little bit more for the faster service. And so now we're going to try to identify all these three types of consolidation. We're going to identify vehicle, temporal, and inbound, outbound consolidation using this data. So let's start with vehicle consolidation. We have two shipments coming in from St. Louis, Missouri, and Kansas City, Missouri, both arriving on 30th March, 3/30. So these shipments are coming on 30th of March. If you look at the map, St. Louis is kind of on the way. If you start at Kansas City here and we're going to Columbus, Ohio, and you're going to first take the highway towards the east. That's going to pass right by St. Louis. You can just drop in and pick up the second shipment, then go to Columbus, Ohio. It's just on the way. So we can consolidate into the same truck. We can call the LTL truck that's going to ship 6,000, convert that to a TL shipment, and tell the TL truck you have one more pickup in St. Louis for 14,000 pounds. 6,000 plus 14,000 is well below the 44,000 truckload weight limit, and so one truckload shipment combining these two shipments which are arriving on 30th March is going to be a lot more cheaper than one truckload and one LTL shipment. So we save a lot of money right there. Okay, but that depends on St. Louis being on the way from Kansas City. So you need a map. You need to put your suppliers and customers on a map, put in thumb pins or whatever to indicate them, and you want to see where this combination can happen. Transportation management system can help you identify such combinations as well, but you can also do it manually like what we are doing by looking at the map. Now we noticed that one day before, just one day earlier, another 16,000 pounds is flowing from St. Louis to Columbus, arriving at 29th of March. Okay, it's a truckload shipment. So if we can call up the supplier in St. Louis and say, hey, we want you to delay your shipment by one day. Instead of picking up your shipment on early morning of the 29th or on the 28th, we're going to pick up on the 29th, most likely, and we're going to deliver it on the 30th to us. So, we're going to have to save it either for one day or half a day more. So if the supplier agrees, then we just have one truckload shipment, starts in Kansas City with 6,000 pounds, goes to St. Louis, picks up, 30,000 pounds from there, 16,000 plus 14,000, still under 44,000 pounds. And, assuming we don't get cubed out, space is not a problem. And then we move to Columbus, Ohio. So we combine 3 shipments into one, with one extra stop in St. Louis, and that's going to save us a lot of money. Now, the blue box, that's called a temporal consolidation because you have to move the date. So that shipment is going to come on 29th March. Now it's going to arrive on 30th March. So you're moving the date. That's why it's called temporal. But the other 2 shipments from arriving on 30th March, we call them vehicle consolidation because we are not changing the date. We're just putting them on the same truck. Okay. Now let's look at inbound outbound consolidation. Again, this can be a little bit tricky because you have to look at an inbound truck, and then that truck has to go back to its terminal or its business operation where it operates from. And so you have to find an outbound shipment that's kind of on the way of its return trip. Now, the carrier companies don't like their trucks returning empty and running empty. And so they love if they deliver something and then get an outbound shipment for the return journey. So look at this. Look at where Memphis is on this map and where Cincinnati is and where Columbus is. If you're coming from Memphis to Columbus and you want to go back to Memphis because that's where you operate out of as a trucking company, you would love to not drive empty from Columbus to Cincinnati. You would love that shipment to make some revenue on the way back. And because Cincinnati is a reasonably sized city, you might find another shipment from Cincinnati to Memphis for that part of the return journey as well. But anyway, if you call up your carrier and say, you're bringing the shipment in on the 27th of March, I can load up an outgoing shipment that you deliver, on the 28th to Cincinnati, Ohio, because you might arrive at the end of the day on 27th. I have to offload you, load you with the next shipment. And so I'm fine with you delivering one day earlier to Cincinnati, Ohio. Again, you have to call up the customer in Cincinnati, Ohio, or the site and tell them, hey, instead of getting your shipment on the 29th, you're going to get it one day earlier. Is that okay? And most likely it's okay. The warehouse has some space to store it. So then your truck comes in from Memphis on the 27th of March. You load it with 9,000 pounds for Cincinnati, Ohio. This outbound shipment is going to be cheaper now because the trucking company will give you a discount because you're giving them some load to take on the way back. Okay, especially if you tell them it's going to happen a lot. You can say, oh, I bring in stuff from Memphis a lot and I ship to Cincinnati a lot. So a lot of your inbound shipment coming in from Memphis, I'm going to give you something to go back on the way to Cincinnati. And then they would be able to negotiate a lower rate for you because you're giving them shipments on the way back and they don't have to drive the truck empty on the way back for part of the trip. Okay. Again, you're doing some temporal stuff here because if the truck arrives at 3:27 and offloads in 2 hours or 3 hours or whatever, they might want to leave on the same day or early next day. So you can't have them stick around till the 29th of March because Columbus to Ohio is half a day or less than that. door to door, including loading time. And so you will probably have to deliver this shipment on the 28th of March, not the 29th. Okay? Or the 27th. If they expect to arrive early on the 27th, you can offload and load the truck and send them on their way out and have them delivered to Cincinnati on the 27th. So that's inbound, outbound consolidation. It's really powerful. And then the last one is temporal consolidation. Here we have two shipments that are supposed to go to Newark and Philadelphia, which are two cities pretty close to each other, about a couple hours away. Okay, and because the Newark shipment is bigger, 10,000 pounds, and has to be delivered on 30th of March, and the customer there might say, I can't take this huge shipment early. Okay, then what you can do is you can deliver the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania shipment early in the day and then go to Newark, or you could deliver the Philadelphia one day early, towards the evening of 29th March, and then arrive in Newark with a shipment on the 30th of March. So that's called temporal consolidation if you have to change the date of the Philadelphia shipment. If not, if you can do both on the same day, that'll just be vehicle consolidation. But if you have to change the date, it will be temporal consolidation as well. Okay, and this makes sense because shipping 125 pounds by a 2-day service to Philadelphia is going to be expensive. If you already have a truck going that way to Newark, it makes sense to just put the 125 pounds on that truck and have the truck make an extra stop. They might charge you $100 for the extra stop, but that'll be cheaper than a whole 2-day service to ship 125 pounds all the way to Philadelphia with a 2-day service. Okay. So again, for temporal consolidation, you look at the inbound table and the outbound shipments table. For vehicle consolidation, you look at inbound table and outbound table. And for outbound consolidation, you have to look at two tables together because you have to match an incoming shipment with an outgoing shipment. Much easier to do if you have a whole big map stuck on your wall with points marked on it. Maybe thread, like you see in movies, you have thumbtacks with thread marking different lanes and routes. If you do all that setup and you have these regular shipments between different cities, you can do a lot of consolidation and you can save a lot of money. This is a really important strategy. Also, the transportation management system can help you do that, identify possible opportunities for consolidation, and you can take advantage of them. So please remember this. This could be a game changer if you do a lot of shipments from certain set cities to do consolidation, and it can reduce, it can save you a lot of money on your transportation expense. So that's, we have one last topic left before we wrap up. So the last topic is carrier performance scorecard. This is the idea that when you're working with transportation carriers, and remember, a lot of these are small carriers if you're talking about trucking companies in the US, you want to make sure that you're working with the best players and getting good service or the contracted service. You want to evaluate them. Often companies use a carrier performance scorecards. So in this example, scorecard have 5 dimensions in 5 rows: on-time delivery, loss and damage rate. That's never going to be 0 in a long term, but you want to be close to 0. Billing accuracy, you don't want your carriers to bill you the wrong amounts because then you have to pay somebody on your company to check each invoice and make corrections, and that's cost for you. So it's easier to deal with companies that bill you accurately. Equipment condition, why does that matter? Why do you care? Because if their equipment breaks down, they fix it. Like, it's not your responsibility, because when equipment breaks down, it causes delays. Increases your lead time, increases your lead time variability, which increases your safety stocks and inventory costs. So you want to work with companies that have clean equipment and good condition equipment, so there's no breakdown. They're doing preventive maintenance, things like that. And then customer service, do they reply to you when there's an issue? Can you get information from them about where your shipment is? Things like that. Now, all of these 5 dimensions would have their own metrics, like on-time delivery might be percentage score, but we're going to convert all of those metrics to a 0 to 5 score. So if on-time delivery is more than 98% or 99, whatever, is reasonable, for the top carriers, we give them a 5 out of 5. If they're less than 92%, they're like really poor, we might give them 0 out of 5. Okay. Same thing for the other loss and damage. If it's less than some threshold, we give them 5. If it's more than 2% or some other threshold, we give them 0. So every dimension goes to a 0 to 5 scale. Even like a 1-0 dimension, equipment is good or bad, goes to 0 or 5, not 0 and 1. Okay. What this does is when the scale is the same, we can then multiply them by the weight factor, the weight we want to give to each dimension, to calculate a weighted average. Okay. So in this case, the weights are going to add up to 100 divided by 5, because each dimension's max score is 5. So So if you divide 100 by 5, the weight should add up to 20. So you do 8 plus 5, 13, plus 3, 16, plus 2, 18, plus 2, 20. So the weights add up to 20, so that when you do the weighted average, the max possible score is 100. Okay, you get 100 if you get 5 on each dimension. Okay. So potential score column is simply the weight factor multiplied by 5. So 8 times 5 is 40. That's the highest score you can get on on-time delivery. 5 times 5 is 25. That's the highest score you can get on loss and damage, and so on. And then the achieved score, or the criteria score, is what they actually achieved. So if this particular carrier was giving us 97% on-time delivery, we'll give them a 4 on on-time delivery. And then 4 multiplied by 8 would give us 32 as their score on this dimension. Similarly, if they got a 4 in loss and damage, they'll be 5 times 4 or 20 in the second dimension. Let's say they got a 5 in billing accuracy, they'll be 5 times 3, 15 on the third dimension, and so on. And then we add up the criteria score, the last column, to figure out what score they get, and then we can rank them by score and talk to the worst performers and say, we don't like you, your performance is way worse than the other carriers we deal with. Either we let you go, or you improve your performance and things like that, or you give us a discount. And so that is important, because if you don't do that, you will have some carriers performing much worse than others, and affecting your lead times, affecting variability in lead times, affecting loss and damage rates, which you have to then write off because you receive a defective product or a damaged product. Okay, so very common technique. Again, you can build this into your transportation management system, where it will look at the billing accuracy, on-time delivery. It will calculate all these numbers for you and show you the scorecards for different carriers and highlight the ones which are doing badly. Or you can also do it manually in Excel. But this is one way that carrier performance is evaluated, and then we renegotiate our carrier contracts, and sometimes get rid of poor performing carriers and get new ones. So that's it for this lecture. We covered a lot of important details. The first half was mostly about transportation rates. Then we talked about domestic shipping FOB terms, international shipping Incoterms. We talked about letter of credit. We talked about consolidation. It's an extremely important topic in transportation management. We talked about carrier performance management. So, with this, we've kind of done a broad overview of transportation management.